Vamos a seguir con la ponencia de Seguros de Energía a cargo de Jonathan Bruce. Él ha sido recomendado por la Banda Superior para Abogados de la Sección de Seguros de América Latina de la Chamber Latin American durante todos los años desde el año 2013 en adelante. O sea, es un gran abogado. Cuando comentó esta cámara, que según las fuentes tiene la mentalidad empresarial, ve el panorama general y tiene excelentes conexiones de trabajo en toda la región de Latinoamérica y el mercado anglosajón. ¿Sí? Es particularmente consciente de brindar un buen servicio y siempre está dispuesto a encontrar una resolución siempre que sea posible. La guía del 2016 de la Chamber UK comenta que es desestimado. Jonathan Bruce es una opción popular para los clientes del sector de seguros y reaseguros para el tema de energía. Es un líder en su campo en UK. El Holman Fenwick Law Firm tiene su sede en la City de Londres. Para los que conocen Londres, Londres es una metrópoli financiera de seguros y reaseguros a nivel global, pero la City es el corazón financiero anglosajón. Así que démosle un fuerte aplauso y adelante.
Thanks, Joe. I would like to say first, thank you very much to Yolanda and Alfie for inviting us here. We've been good friends, me and Alfie, for many years, about 20 years, when we were working together many years ago. Just going to turn that. It always amazes me that Yolanda has been able to build up such a great reputation and a wonderful organisation, and also to produce so many talented children. And quite a few of them are here today, of course, which is good. There is one who's not here today, but I hear that she has married an English man, so she obviously has very good taste. I'm pleased to hear. The other thing is, I would like to take this opportunity to wish all of you very good luck tonight against New Zealand. I was actually mistaken in the hotel lift for being from New Zealand, so I had to correct some people. I am definitely supporting Peru tonight, there's no question about that. Yo voy a hablar en inglés, disculpa, perdón. It was very kind of Chris to speak in English for my benefit, partly in English, partly in Spanish. But we have got the translation. In terms of the questions afterwards, please feel free to ask in Spanish. There's no problem about that. Speak slowly, and hopefully I'll understand. Okay, so I'm going to talk to you about some common coverage issues which we see in energy claims, both insurance and reinsurance. And Chris has already explained that the importance of reinsurance and the fact that we have issues in reinsurance as well as at the insurance level. So I'll be touching on that. Quite often in energy insurance, we have fronting situations where you have the local insurer with very little retention, if any. So the issues which affect reinsurers can have a direct consequence on the coverage. So we have to look at it from that aspect as well. Energy insurance, there's no magic to it really. It's just property and casualty and construction insurance, but with a lot of zeros on the end. There's a lot of money involved in these cases. So why are there coverage issues? Well, that's a very easy question to answer. It's so that we lawyers can earn some money. But no, that's not the real answer. In terms of operational policies, you usually have individual wordings which have been going on for many years, and over time these need to be corrected with experience of claims, and that's where the brokers come in. Also, you have package policies with which are multi-year and multi-line, and quite often these are not very specific to the actual risk, and that's another issue which the broker ought to be aware of. You can have general terms and specific terms, and often these might not be consistent with each other. In those cases, the specific term should take priority, or take precedence. We see core master policies, which might be inconsistent with the local wordings. So you have to look at both, and hopefully the broker will have sorted that one out as well. You can also have, in fact, as Chris was saying, you can have inconsistencies where the local policy is subject to, say, Peruvian law, and the reinsurance is subject to, say, English law. So that is an area where you can have disputes and misunderstandings at both ends, and this can cause enormous problems. In terms of the trigger for coverage, sometimes it's not clear what is the trigger, but usually in property covers it is damage. But it's not always clear what is damage and what is a defect, and there can be differences and disputes as to which is a defect and what's a damage. And so I'll come back to that as well. Yeah. Yeah. It's okay.
Yeah. Sorry.
Okay, thanks. Construction policies. Onshore construction policies will have very similar issues to offshore construction policies. I'm also going to talk about the defects exclusions. So you have DE 1 to 5 and leg 1, 2, and 3. So I'll mention those. Usually, onshore construction wordings are not standard forms, whereas they are standard in the offshore construction, where we have the well car form. This is very good because it's a very well-known wording, so everyone knows exactly where they are with it. There are some shortcomings and problems with the well car wording, but everyone is well aware of these, and they're able to draft around it. There has been recently an effort to review and reform the well car wording, but in the end they decided to abandon that project. It was just too controversial, and people were generally quite happy with the old wording, but at some stage it will need to be updated. In fact, there have been no reported cases yet in the English courts on the well car wording or disputes regarding the well car wording, which shows, I think, that it's a good wording. There is actually one case that I'm involved in where we have just started proceedings, so that could be the first one where in a couple of years' time you might find that case gets reported. But at the moment, there are no cases. These cases almost always get settled, partly because there is so much money involved in these claims, and also it is quite a small world in the energy claims world. Everyone knows each other and they have ongoing relationships. There's not many major reinsurer leaders, and they have very strong relationships with the big brokers, which they want to protect, and they don't want to have disputes if they can avoid them. But obviously there are disputes. Contract certainty is a buzzword, or two buzzwords, which Chris mentioned in his talk. And it is something which has often been talked about over the last 10 years. The idea is that the insured wants to make sure that what needs to be covered is actually covered. It's in both the insured's and the insurer's interests to make sure that the policy does what it says it does. But we all know how difficult it is to have an insurance wording which is completely watertight, because we don't have a crystal ball, and also certain reinsurers will look at things differently to others, and we can't predict how they're going to react. So there will be disputes, however good the wording is. You do need to understand, though, how the insurances interact with each other, where you've got multiple policies in place. And particularly, as I said, in energy insurance, you will almost always have reinsurance. So you have the different levels which have to be, both of them, looked at. Often in this area, you have captives involved as well. So that's where you have a large oil company, for example, which has its own captive. But it doesn't make too much difference, because those captive insurers will normally have local cedant insurers involved as well. And also they reinsure large chunks of their risk to the international reinsurance market. So whether there's a captive involved or not, you're almost always going to have reinsurers involved, either in London or internationally. One issue which quite often crops up is the one of who exactly is the insured or co-insured. Usually this will include contractors, subcontractors, associated companies, even mortgagees. Mortgagees will usually be lost payees who just have a right to the sale proceeds. Usually there will be a waiver of subrogation clauses in the policy which prevent recovery against named parties, and in particular against other insureds or the principal insured. You have to look not only at the insurance, but also at the underlying contracts, though, to see whether it is possible to subrogate against that particular contractor. And actually, that's a position under English law and in many laws here throughout the world. But it is different in the States. They like to be different in some ways. And certainly in the States, you only need to look at the policy. You don't have to look at the underlying contracts of the contractors. And that has actually had been a major factor in the insurers of Transocean in Deepwater Horizon, because it meant that BP were able to make a claim under Transocean's policy as an additional assured, even though technically they wouldn't have been able to do that if it had been English law that applied. I'm going to talk about mitigation expenses and sue and labour now. Sue and labour is basically exactly the same as mitigation expenses, but it's referred to as sue and labour in the marine and offshore context. We understand that it derives from the Normans in the northern part of France, and it has been described in a famous case, as I put on the screen here, as a mishmash of Norman French marine doctrine and what the parties wanted to have in a contract. Under English law, under our Marine Insurance Act, which has recently been reformed, but not this part of it, you do have an express sue and labour provision. This says that if you have an express sue and labour clause in the policy, then the expenses which are incurred by the insured in avoiding or minimising a loss are automatically recoverable against the insurers. But that doesn't apply to non-marine insurance, only to marine insurance, because our Marine Insurance Act only applies to marine risks. That does include offshore risks, but not onshore. And this became clear because we had a case called Yorkshire Water and Sun Alliance in 1996, where an embankment collapsed and a huge quantity of sewage, raw sewage, flowed into a river. And the insured had to carry out a lot of flood alleviation work, which was very costly, and was unable to recover that from its insurers. So because of this case, now you will almost always find an express mitigation expenses clause in the policy, which allows the insured to recover its expenses. These clauses have to be very carefully drafted to make it absolutely clear what counts as mitigation expenses and what is not. You need to have an express clause for the expense to be recoverable from the insurers. But regardless of whether you have that express clause and whether you can recover it from the insurers or not, there is still an obligation under English law and under most laws to carry out mitigation efforts. And that is actually codified in our Marine Insurance Act, and I've put it on the screen there. It says at section 78 that it's the duty of the assured in all cases to take such measures as may be reasonable for the purpose of averting a loss. And that principle applies to marine insurance and non-marine insurances, or all insurance. In order for a claim to be made under this head of mitigation expenses, the damage has to be imminent. And actually, you can have a sue and labour claim even where there is no damage at all. Conversely, if you have a total loss, a claim for a total loss, you can still have sue and labour in addition to the total loss. And in this case, the insured has to act reasonably at all times in order to recover for sue and labour. And that has come out of this case, ICS and British Traders, which I put on the screen there. And it was said by the court in that case, it's not necessary for the assured that a loss would very probably have occurred, but rather that he had acted as a reasonable person upon preserving his property. In the same way, the expenditure must have been reasonable. He can't just spend whatever he likes. And it's irrelevant whether the mitigation efforts worked or didn't work. It's still possible to make the claim for mitigation expenses. In the absence of express wording, it is only unusual or extraordinary expenses which will be covered as mitigation expenses, and only while the insured property is in the grip of peril, so in imminent danger. So, for example, the costs of preventing the collapse of a platform would be sue and labour, but not the cost of towing the platform for repairs and then taking it back to where it was before. That would not be sue and labour. And that was actually claimed in a famous case, the New Killer, which I'll refer to 2 or 3 times. This is a big offshore energy case in England from 1996. And in this case, there was a platform, an offshore platform that was defective, and it was held not to be reasonable for the insurers to have to pay for the towage all the way to Singapore from Indonesia. and under the Sue and Labour clause. So all that could be claimed was the cost of making the platform safe exactly where it was. So they had to jack it up and anchor it, and the cost of doing that was recovered as Sue and Labour, but nothing else. So I'm now going to talk about fortuity. I'm talking here on these issues from an English law perspective, because ultimately the reinsurers who are in England will look at these issues through English law eyes, even if the reinsurance policy is going to be subject to a local law. So it is important for you to understand what they will expect. But in the case of fortuity, the law is going to be the same in all laws. You always have to have fortuity for an insurance claim to be covered. There is a lot of case law confirming that losses have to be accidental to be recoverable. And this applies to onshore and offshore energy, and both property and casualty, and in fact, all insurance and reinsurance. All insurance claims, you need fortuity. And that means that the loss must not be certain to take place, or it must not have been caused deliberately by the insured. And as was said in the Sawyer and White case that I've got on the screen here, the whole concept of insurance is about risks, not certainties. And this is restated in many, many judgments time and again. And a few of these are quoted up on the screen here. I'm not going to go through them all. It's always important to identify what is the proximate cause of the loss. And firstly, it is up to the insured to show that the loss, to show that the proximate cause is an insured peril. So the burden will be on the insured to do that. And then it's for the insurers who have the burden to show that an exclusion applies. There are some statutory exclusions which will apply under Peruvian law and which certainly apply under English law. We have our Marine Insurance Act, as I mentioned before, and that excludes wear and tear and inherent vice. But generally, exclusions have to be set out clearly in the policy. Talking about inherent vice, there can be arguments about whether the cause is inherent vice or some other accidental cause. And this happened recently in a case called the Sendor Mopu. In this case, there was an offshore platform that was being transported on a vessel upside down past South Africa. And they had very bad weather, and all three of the legs fell off into the sea. In fact, these legs all had small cracks in them, so it was likely to happen anyway. And the insurers were saying that this was inherent vice. And the Supreme Court, which is our old House of Lords, it's now been renamed the Supreme Court, decided that because there was bad weather in this case, that was a fortuity, and that took precedence in this case, even though there was inherent vice, which was also a cause. So we now know that the inherent vice exclusion will only operate effectively as an exclusion if there is no other external accident, such as bad weather, at the same time. That is new law in the UK. Wear and tear is excluded automatically in offshore situations under English law and under most laws that we deal with. I'm sure it's the same in Peru. we've got our Marine Insurance Act, which expressly excludes wear and tear. In onshore energy, where the Marine Insurance Act does not apply, as I mentioned, you will almost always have an express exclusion for gradual deterioration or wear and tear. But even if you don't, the insurers will say that's not a fortuity. If it's wear and tear, that's not a fortuity, and therefore it's not covered. It is fairly easy, though, to displace wear and tear as a proximate cause. And a good illustration of that is this Caribbean Sea case. In that case, there was a latent defect which displaced the wear and tear. There was defective welding in a vessel, which led to fatigue cracks, and then ultimately the vessel sank. In that case, the loss was covered, even though it looked like wear and tear. And I have been involved in some corrosion claims, including one off North Africa on a pipeline, and also one off Mexico, which was a platform where there was a piece of piping that was corroded. But the cause of the corrosion was sulfate-reducing bacteria, which is a form of accelerated corrosion. And that type of corrosion could easily be a fortuity and not wear and tear. So it's not always easy to identify what is wear and tear and what isn't. As a rule of thumb, if you have corrosion, which is ordinary corrosion and not accelerated corrosion, that will be excluded as wear and tear. Loss and damage caused by latent defects is normally covered, provided that we're talking about resultant damage and not just latent defects becoming patent damage. And there is a quote here from Arnold, which is on the screen here. Arnold is the Bible that we use more and refer to that very frequently for English marine insurance law. And these principles apply for non-marine insurance as well as for marine insurance. And it says here that a latent defect is defined as a condition which may give rise to progressive damage or deterioration over a considerable period, perhaps spanning several policy periods without it being discovered, without there being anything specific which can be described as a casualty or loss. That's latent defect. In the Nucilla, which is the case I mentioned, there were very small microscopic cracks in the legs of an offshore platform. And at the time of the inception of the policy, it was impossible to see these cracks. But over time, they gradually got worse and fractures developed. And it got to the stage where it was inevitable that the entire platform would probably collapse. And so the Court of Appeal said that this was not simply a latent defect becoming patent. It was well beyond that. They said that metal had fractured and that was damage to the hull. But it can be extremely difficult to distinguish between what is defects and what is damage. In onshore energy construction, there are standard defects exclusions. For example, the DE 1 to 5 and leg 1 to 3. And some of these will exclude all defects or all damage due to defects. So leg 1 and DE 1 do that, for example. For some of them, the defective part itself will be excluded, but resultant damage, which is caused by the defect, will be covered. So, for example, leg 2 is like that. And then there's others like leg 3, which is only intended to cover damage. So rectification and improvements and betterment are not covered in the leg 3 exclusion situation. Faulty design. With faulty design, you don't have to show any fault or negligence by the designers. All you have to do is to show that the design turned out to be not fit for purpose. Faulty design might be an insured peril, but and it might be expressly covered, but usually we find it referred to in an exclusion, and normally where the cover is for all risks. And that's where you will find reference to faulty design. Betterment or improvements are always excluded because insurance is supposed to be a contract of indemnity for actual losses which have been suffered by the insureds. The insured is not supposed to be making a profit from insurance. And that might be news to some insureds, as we all know, but that is certainly the intention of insurance. What is a part? This is a question that often comes up. For offshore energy construction, the standard wording, as I mentioned, is the Wellcar 2001 form. And this excludes defective parts altogether, but then there is a buyback with a sublimit for the defective part itself. And often we have issues as to what is a part for the purposes of that clause or for the purposes of that buyback. This can also be a problem in onshore energy insurance, depending on the wording, because you have to work out what is the defective part and separate that from the rest of the insured property, and that can be extremely difficult. For example, is it the screw? Is that the defective part? Or is it a bulkhead that the screw went into? Or is it the structure that the bulkhead is a part of? And so on. It's very difficult to identify what is actually the part for the purposes of this clause. And there have been quite a lot of disputes about that. There have also been some cases that have gone to court which have tried to clarify what is meant by part, but none of these have had much success, unfortunately. We're still waiting for a case which will clarify this. But this was discussed in the Miss JJ case on the screen there. And the court said there that what if failure occurs in one continuous structure? Were they separate parts or merely different areas of a single part? A complete solution is hard to find. So there was no answer in that case. They just acknowledged that it was a difficult question. In the nuclear, this same question was also considered in our Court of Appeal. And this decided to apply the obviousness test. The court said that the welds, in this case, which were defective, were just as much a part as the bulkhead or a plate or the totality of the leg, which again doesn't help us much, because that could mean that the entire structure is a part and therefore is subject to the sublimit. And that's certainly not the intention. The court said that the part argument leads to absurd results. It provides no criteria for distinguishing between what is and what is not damage. The suggested criteria, what can be physically separated, what performs a separate function, are not in the clause. The only way that you can definitely get round this problem is by listing every single part in the policy, down to individual screws, individual welds. But no one is ever going to do that. The policy would never, in the end, get placed. It would take too long and be too difficult to spell out all the parts. So we're left with this problem, I'm afraid. Another key question that we often get in property insurance cases, and certainly in energy, is what is damage? What is meant by damage? Because most policies will require loss or damage in order for cover to be triggered. They'll need damage during that policy period. So is physical damage required? And what about rectification expenses or defects? And we've got in Humber and Canary Wharf, which I put on the screen there, probably the best definition that I'm aware of under English law of what damage is. And the Court of Appeal said that damage is in the physical change which renders the article less useful or less valuable. And that's a quotation I've had to refer to in many, many letters over the years. That is the best definition of damage. So does damage have to be physical? Does it have to be physical damage? Most property and construction all risks policies will expressly only cover physical loss or damage, and it will actually have the word physical in the policy. But it's not very clear what is damage and what is a defect. And there have been a couple of cases which have tried to clarify the difference between these two concepts. Firstly, there is this case Bacardi and Thomas Hardy packaging. Now, in this case, benzene had accidentally, during the manufacturing process, found its way into the bottles of Bacardi Breezes. It's a drink that was popular at one time. And there was an exclusion in the supply contract for direct physical damage. And our Court of Appeal decided that the product in this case was not damaged, but merely defective at the moment of creation. So they clearly drew a distinction there between, on the one hand, what is a defect and what is damage. And we had a very similar case, again, not an insurance case, Pilkington and CG, or not a property insurance case, that is actually a liability insurance case. Here there were defective glass panels that had been installed at the Eurostar train terminal in Waterloo Station in London. And the Court of Appeal said, no, that is not damage. Damage requires some altered state. So probably, even if the word physical is not used, it will be automatically implied that there must be physical damage and not simply a defect, which was always there from the moment of creation. So a tricky example in an offshore context where would be where you've got a platform that's got piling problems due to unsuitable foundations. So it's actually sinking into the seabed, but there's no actual damage to the substructure. In that case, there's no physical damage to insured property. So even though the owners would face massive rectification expenses, none of that would be covered as property damage. It might be possible to claim some of it as mitigation expenses or sue and labour, but not much of it. We do find, though, that it is possible for underwriters, by mistake, to extend the cover to cover rectification expenses. And this happened, for example, in the case I've put on the screen here, cementation, piling, and Egon. And here there was a construction all risks claim for consequential rectification of a dock wall in a port. And the dock wall itself was not damaged. And the policy in this case covered indemnity in respect of physical damage. It's very important, those words, in respect of, which had been added by the underwriter. Actually, he intended to clarify it, but the judge decided in this case that by adding those words in respect of, that actually extended the cover to rectification costs. So it wasn't purely physical damage that was covered simply because of those words that had been added into the policy. So underwriters have got to be very, very careful. If they want to cover only physical damage, they have to say that in the policy. It will normally be implied, but there are dangers in not using that word. Now that's the position under English law, but it will also be the same under any local law where I've been involved in claims in South America. Unrepaired damage. This has cropped up as an issue in a couple of claims that I've been dealing with recently, energy insurance claims. It's always worth considering if you're bringing a claim after the policy has expired, whether it is possible to include a claim for unrepaired damage. And in one case, which I'm dealing with at the moment, we have just tripled the claim amount because we realised that the brokers had not included a claim for unrepaired damage. And in this case, the unrepaired damage, it was an umbilical which had been damaged during construction works offshore. The unrepaired damage was £20 million. It's about $30 million. So a very significant amount. In other cases, unrepaired damage can cause problems because if the repairs were never actually carried out, it can limit the claim potentially to the value of the depreciated asset. And if you've got, say, an offshore platform which is 30 years old, you might find that in the insured's books, that has been depreciated down to zero. So potentially, your claim could be limited to zero in such a case. Under our Marine Insurance Act, the insured is entitled to be indemnified for reasonable depreciation arising from the unrepaired damage. So it's all clear in our Marine Insurance Act. Obviously, that can't exceed the reasonable cost of repair, though. And that can be the case even if you've got an agreed value in the policy, unless the insurer accepts that there has been a constructive total loss, in which case they will pay out the full agreed value. For onshore risks, it depends purely what it says in the policy. This might be cost of reinstatement. That is normally the best thing for insureds, by the way. That will lead to the largest indemnity, normally cost of reinstatement. But often we see RCV, replacement cash value, and that is actual cash value less depreciation. So again, depreciation becomes relevant. And wherever you've got depreciation involved, this can drastically reduce the indemnity, depending on the wording, if you're unlucky. And this can be complicated by the local law of the policy, but this is normally the case, because it's in the plain English, what it actually says in the policy. I'm I'm going to run through now a few points which apply to casualty or liability insurance. Many of the common coverage issues that I've talked about for property insurance also apply to casualty insurance. But there are a few extra ones which I just want to mention here and go through quickly, which are on the screen. Firstly, what triggers cover under in a liability cover is the liability. And it's not damage, it's the liability. And that can be either tortious, which is extra contractual, non-contractual, or contractual. And typical ones would be pollution, contamination, personal injury or death, damage to third-party property, damage to existing property, product liability, and product recall. And I think you'll find that most reinsurers in London and internationally are paranoid about liabilities in Latin America, particularly because in many jurisdictions in Latin America, we find the courts are very slow. It can take 10 or 20 years to get a finding of liability. And frequently during those 10 or 20 years, there will be monetary correction due to devaluations and so on, which can massively increase the amount of the claim. And we've seen this in a recent case in Brazil, for example, where the original loss was only 10 million, but it was sitting in court for about 15 years, and now the loss is more like 60 million due to monetary correction. And the reinsurers are going, well, why didn't you settle this 15 years ago? In the context of contractors, you usually have knock for knock. You've probably heard of that. That means each contractor is responsible for damage to its own property. And also mutual indemnities. It's the same thing. And under cross-liability clauses, usually you get that where all of the contractors and subcontractors are all insured under the same policy, and one is liable to another, then the claim is payable in the same way as if that party had not been insured under the policy. It will still be covered. Gross negligence, that leads to, or can lead to, a failure of the indemnities if there's gross negligence or willful misconduct. And that is normally excluded. That's the consequence. It comes out of the cover at that stage. I've already mentioned additional insureds, and that can prevent recoveries against additional insured subrogation waiver scenarios. Claims notification, actually Chris was talking about disputes about claims notification, which can certainly occur in energy cases as well. We see claims made, reinsurance notifications, and losses arising during or discovery, different types of clauses for notification. And often there are disputes about whether a claim was properly notified in time to the correct policy. So sometimes the wrong policy, the wrong insurers will have been notified by mistake. Obviously, there might, in those cases, be a liability for the brokers, or for the lawyers if you had a lawyer involved at that time. The exclusions, well, all the principles about exclusions that I mentioned in relation to property insurance also apply to liability insurance, but we do see some specific and different types of exclusion. So, for example, fines are usually excluded in liability covers. Fines normally wouldn't be recoverable anyway on the grounds of illegality, but we do get express exclusions for fines. Also, moral damages can find you can find them excluded in reinsurances. And that can be a big issue in Latin American jurisdictions where we find huge awards of moral damages by courts for personal injury or death claims. You see buybacks for damage to existing property and buybacks for cleanup. Aggregation, Chris mentioned that as well, but the number of deductibles and the number of limits is an issue which is very common in liability claims as well as for property claims. And so, for example, in a contamination case or pollution case, it could be argued that there was more than one event, so numerous deductibles, or alternatively, that the entire loss was caused from one pre-existing event, in which case the whole thing can be excluded. And that is now the case in an ongoing case for onshore pollution that we're dealing with in Colombia at the moment. As to cause and quantum, we normally leave these aspects to the adjuster, of course, and we only become involved if there's a dispute. But there often are disputes about quantum, particularly in complicated business interruption and delay in startup claims, for example. And also there will be disputes about cause. And obviously, cause and coverage are very relevant to each other. So we do get involved in those disputes. Chris already covered this slide basically in his presentation, but obviously the issue of law and jurisdiction and back-to-backness is equally important in energy insurance as it is in financial institutions risks, or in any class for that matter. And in energy insurance, as I mentioned before, it is very frequent to have reinsurance because of the vast amount of capacity that's required. So I'm not going to run over those points, but the same ones will apply in energy insurance. And it's also very important to check if there is a follow settlements clause or a claims cooperation clause in the reinsurance. And again, I'm not going to repeat what Chris said, but this is equally applicable to energy claims. I am, though, just going to mention one point which arose in a recent case, energy claim that I was handling in Mexico in relation to claims control clauses. The reinsurance had the standard market NMA 2751 clause, which I put on the screen there. And this says basically that reinsurers can control negotiations, adjustments, and settlements. So those three things. Now, in that particular case, we were acting for the captive, effectively the local insurer. And we were arguing that those three things did not include control over proceedings or defense of proceedings. And they were saying, no, it's supposed to be included in adjustments, but it's not. If you read the actual clause, it doesn't say that. It just says negotiations, adjustments, and settlements. So we were saying, well, in theory, it would be possible for us to effectively sue ourselves because the captive obviously has very similar interests to the insured. Sue ourselves, not allow the reinsurer to interfere with the defence of that claim, and that would lead to a liability. It would lead to a judgment against the captive, which would be automatically enforceable against the retrocessionaires. And I think that was a very powerful argument. In fact, we settled the case favourably, but I think that was a good argument. And I think you'll find that retrocessionaires, particularly in energy cases who are aware of this point, will now be looking very carefully at the claims control clauses to see if they can include control of proceedings and defence of proceedings, as well as the three things that are actually in the clause. There can also be lost in translation issues. And a very good example of this is a reported case that we had in England, which is Wise underwriting against GNP. And here, there was a cargo cover for a Cancun retailer who is exporting Rolexes from Miami into Mexico. And in the local policy, the cargo was referred to as relojes, which, as we all know, that can mean either watches or clocks. And unfortunately, in the reinsurance, it was actually translated as clocks in English. And then the English court held that this was a material non-disclosure, and the reinsurers were entitled to avoid the policy, all because one little word was wrongly translated. So that shows you how important it is to have accurate translations. And quite often it will be left to the brokers to organise the translations, and if they get it wrong, of course, they can be liable for that. So it's something to watch out for sure. Finally, I'm going to just tell you and update you on a couple of new laws which have come in the UK, which are very relevant to all insurance, not just energy insurance, but certainly to energy insurance. Firstly, there's the UK Insurance Act of 2015, and for many years we only had the Marine Insurance Act of 1906. I've referred to this a few times, but it wasn't updated for many, many years. It was extremely well drafted, in fact, but it was felt a few years ago that it should be updated. And actually, ironically, this is a very short new law. It was after 9 or 10 years of consultations, the new law was produced, and there are actually very little changes. But the changes that have come in are very important. And these came into effect for any insurance contract which is subject to English law as from August of last year. Now, I mean, of course, many reinsurances that you're involved in will not be subject to English law, but they have been in the past, and my hope is that now English law will have been brought into line with many other jurisdictions, and there'll be less for insureds to worry about if they do end up with English law. And that's because the law makes some important changes to the area around material non-disclosure, this has always been a very big problem with English law, I think, for foreign insureds, because before there was only one remedy for non-disclosure, and that was avoidance, meaning absolutely no cover at all. So it's an all or nothing remedy. And now I'm pleased to say that this new law brings in proportionate remedies. So the court will decide if the insurer would have agreed cover, but on slightly different terms or a higher premium, or with warranties in place, etc., then those would be taken as if they had applied from the outset. So no longer will it be possible for insurers to completely get off the hook without paying anything, unless he can prove that he would never have underwritten the risk in the first place, which is very, very difficult to prove. That is this is going to lead to some disputes about whether a risk would have been underwritten or not. But so far, I'm not aware of any. I'm not sure. Chris, have you come across any disputes based on this? No.
You're right.
Another important change is to warranties, making it harder for insurers or reinsurers to rely on what I would call technicality breaches, where the warranty breached was not intended to reduce the risk of the actual loss which occurred. So now we've got a kind of form of causal test for warranties, which is very good news for cedents and insurers. Insureds, because it makes it much harder now for claims to be rejected and to fail due to a very small technical breach of a warranty. And we have seen those many times in the past. And then the other new piece of legislation that has come in is the Enterprise Act of 2016. And this is a new right, which is very important to be aware of under English law, for an insured to claim damages against insurers for late payment. And exactly the same would apply in reinsurance. So a cedent could bring a claim against a reinsurer for late payment. And that applies to all policies that have been underwritten since May of this year. So it's very, very recent. And Section 13 of that new law, it says that the insurer must pay sums due in respect of the claim within a reasonable time. And if they don't, there will be damages. And then it goes on to say that a reasonable time includes a reasonable time to investigate and assess the claim. I mean, the problem is it's not clear what is meant by reasonable, and it's going to take quite a long time for that to be clarified by the courts. So we'll see some disputes, but for sure this makes a big difference. What we do know is that the damages for breach of, for taking an unreasonable time to pay a claim, the damages are uncapped, unlimited. They could be absolutely huge. Obviously, the insured would have to prove his losses, but we have had cases where insurers have completely gone out of business due to late payments of a claim and lack of liquidity of funds. They've had to completely close down their business. So in the old days, before we had this law, it would only be possible to claim interest. And in England, that's very small amounts, 2 or 3% at the moment. So this is going to make a big difference. And generally, I think English law is going to be more attractive going forward because we've got these reforms of our law. So that brings me to the end of the formal talk. I do find energy insurance claims fascinating because they are technically and factually very complex, mind-blowing in fact. You can have all different experts with the most amazing theories. You just hear about these new things. It's very innovative as well. Also, the amounts in dispute can be absolutely huge. If something goes wrong, particularly offshore, it will cost a lot of money to put it right. I think we've now got some time for questions. Yeah, we've got a few minutes. That's the end of my talk. Please do ask questions in Spanish, as long as you speak slowly to me. Hopefully I will understand. And if not, we've got Chris here who can explain and help me.
Finish? Yeah, okay. Un aplauso, por favor. Bruce, could you put this one for the...
Oh, yeah. No, sure, yeah. I think I should understand, yeah. Yeah, it's okay, yeah.
Okay. Preguntas, por favor. A ver.
Muchas gracias. Máximo García de Electro Oriente, Iquitos. Tengo dos preguntas. Básicamente tiene relación con el contrato y la cobertura, que está relacionado con los daños no cubiertos. Cuando un asegurado contrata una póliza, le hace con la seguridad de que va a cubrir lo que él necesita. Y también con la seguridad de que el seguro va a cubrir lo que dice.
Yeah.
¿Cierto? Pero lo que pasa, en nuestro caso, nosotros tenemos grupos electrógenos que generan energía desde 5.000 megavatios para arriba. Sucede que uno de nuestros grupos se siniestra y para reponer la demanda por ese siniestro recurrimos a contratar generadores de menor potencia y en mayor número de unidades para cubrir esa demanda. Eso nos demuestra que tenemos que asumir costos mayores que lo que veníamos asumiendo cuando teníamos los grupos siniestrados, porque el consumo de combustible es mayor con los grupos pequeños en relación con el siniestrado. Desde ahí tenemos ya un problema. Pero nosotros hacemos la denuncia ante la aseguradora, luego de la evaluación de varios meses, se concluye de que esos riesgos no están cubiertos. Eso es uno. Y lo otro, tenemos una póliza de multirriesgo que cubre robos, incendios, vandalismos y otros más. Entonces, ¿qué pasa? Que se genera un robo de cables en un tramo que supera 1 kilómetro. Hacemos la denuncia, se hace la evaluación y el seguro nos indica que ese riesgo no está cubierto. Entonces ahí tenemos un problema, porque los requisitos que ellos, o sea, la aseguradora exige, no están contemplados en la póliza y tampoco está contemplado en los gastos no reconocidos. En el caso del robo de cables, nos indican que ellos reconocen los cables que están dentro de nuestras instalaciones y no los que están ya tendidos.
Yeah.
Entonces, ¿qué es lo que pasa ahí? Hay un problema que la póliza no precisa este tipo de aspectos. Mi pregunta es, ¿existe alguna responsabilidad penal para la aseguradora por no tener claro lo que debe cubrir y qué requisitos debe exigir para que esto sea cubierto? Esa es mi pregunta.
Yeah, okay. I mean, obviously, it does depend on what it says in the policy in terms of the exclusion. And generally, you will find, we find claims being chucked out on exclusions all the time by underwriters in cases like this. But the exclusion, it has to be clear, and it will always be construed and interpreted most strictly against the insurers. But as for penal or criminal sanctions, this is a matter of the local law. I don't know what the position is in Peru, but certainly under English law, we don't have a system of bad faith like they have in the States. And we find in the States, there can be huge damages awards against insurers for bad faith in exactly that type of case, if it turns out that actually the claim was covered. What we've tried to do in England, we've tried to redress this by bringing in this Enterprise Act that I mentioned, which goes some way to compensating the insured in cases exactly like that. But unfortunately, it sounds like your case is actually subject to, I assume, Peruvian law, and we're English lawyers, so I can't really give you a complete answer there. But that's how I would look at it from an English perspective. I don't know, Chris, if you want to add anything.
I agree with everything you said.
Yeah.
Quizás diría que hay que ver si la...
Un ratito. Habría que ver si el uso de la exclusión o los usos de las exclusiones por parte de las aseguradoras son razonables, porque yo no sé exactamente qué es lo que están diciendo y por qué han negado la cobertura. Sí, entonces ahí, pero estoy de acuerdo que penalidad no existe en Inglaterra por el rechazo de un siniestro. Muchas gracias.
Thanks.
Yo asumo de que la respuesta es desde el punto de vista de aseguradores, pero me gustaría la opinión de un abogado peruano que nos diga si realmente podría haber una penalidad en este caso.
Well, to be absolutely clear, we HFW, we are not aligned with reinsurers. We're not aligned with anyone. In fact, we very frequently act against reinsurers in cases exactly like that for local interests, for insureds and for local cedants. So, I mean, the answer wasn't intended to be like that. But certainly, if there are good arguments for coverage that your lawyers are pursuing, then I assume that if it's Peruvian law, there might be a possibility of additional damages. I just don't know, because we're not Peruvian lawyers. But there might be a solution for that. On cases like this, we do work with local lawyers, of course, and you know, perhaps we can have a word afterwards about that. It sounds like you've got local lawyers already involved, but...
Okay.
Lo que sucede está en cómo está estructurado el contrato del seguro, ¿no? En caso de las eléctricas, a nivel nacional hay eléctricas grandes y hay eléctricas pequeñas. Se contratan a través de un ente que es el FONAFE y está diseñada más para eléctricas de mayor volumen. No calza bien con eléctricas menores. Lo que debería hacer el FONAFE es hacer otro tipo de proceso que calce con las eléctricas menores para que sea a la medida. Creo que el contrato no es a la medida, por así decirlo, por ahí hay eléctricas pues que tienen volúmenes. Sí. Bueno, es el contrato, ¿no? Habría que
I mean, it sounds like you don't have contract certainty, like I was saying, and this is an area where really your brokers should be advising you precisely on how to describe, you know, the type of cables like you're talking about that should be covered, and the type of damage that should be covered, and make sure that that is covered in the policy when it's agreed.
I agree.
Yeah.
Ok, última pregunta para cerrar. Muy bien, un aplauso por favor para Jonathan Bruce.